My family and I went on a trip to the Swiss Alps. Suddenly, my daughter-in-law pushed my wife and me off a cliff. Lying there, barely conscious, I heard my wife whisper, "Don't move, pretend you're dead." When they left, she revealed the truth to me. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought my own son would try to kill me. Not until I was lying broken on a rocky ledge in the Swiss Alps, blood trickling from my forehead, listening to my daughter-in-law Victoria's voice echoing from above. "Are they moving down there?" she called out, her tone strangely calm for someone who had just witnessed what should have been a tragic accident. "My name is Randall. I'm 66 years old, and 3 minutes ago I thought I was the luckiest man alive. I had my beloved wife Margaret beside me. We were on a dream vacation in Switzerland, and my son David had finally seemed to be showing genuine affection toward us. The Alpine air was crisp, the mountains breathtaking, and for the first time in years, our family felt whole. Now I was lying on this narrow ledge 20 feet below the hiking trail, every bone in my body screaming with pain, trying to understand how a peaceful family photo opportunity had turned into this nightmare. It had started so innocently. We were standing near the edge of a scenic overlook, one of those picture-perfect spots that tourists dream about, the kind of place where families create memories that last forever. Margaret was adjusting her scarf against the mountain wind, and I was fumbling with the camera settings trying to capture the perfect shot of the four of us together. "Dad, let me help you with that," David had said, stepping closer. For a moment my heart swelled with warmth. My 35-year-old son rarely offered help anymore, rarely showed interest in spending time with us. This trip had been his idea, a surprise gift for our 40th wedding anniversary. "You and Mom deserve something special," he'd said when he'd presented us with the plane tickets 3 months ago. Victoria had been standing slightly apart from us, as she often did. My daughter-in-law had always been reserved, polite, but distant. I'd attributed it to shyness, maybe cultural differences. She was elegant in that untouchable way some women possess, always perfectly dressed, always composed. But there was something about her smile that never quite reached her eyes, something that made me feel like I was being measured and found wanting. "Come closer, Victoria," Margaret had called out, her voice carrying that gentle warmth that had made me fall in love with her 42 years ago. "We want you in the photo, too." That's when everything changed. I remember Victoria's hand on my back, firm and sudden. I remember Margaret's startled gasp. I remember the sensation of falling, the rocks rushing toward us, and then the impact that knocked all the air from my lungs. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. My left shoulder felt like it was on fire, and I could taste blood in my mouth. But worse than the physical pain was the confusion, the disbelief that this was actually happening. Above us, I could hear footsteps, the crunch of gravel as they moved closer to the edge. "Can you see them?" David's voice drifted down, and there was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. Not panic, not the desperate worry of a son whose parents had just fallen off a cliff. He sounded impatient. That's when Margaret's hand found mine, her fingers ice-cold and trembling. "Randall," she whispered, her voice so quiet I could barely hear her over the wind. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." I turned my head slightly, just enough to see her face. Blood was running from a cut on her temple and her breathing was shallow and quick, but her eyes were alert, focused, and filled with something I'd never seen there before. Fear. "Margaret, what?" "Shh." Her grip on my hand tightened. "Trust me, we need them to think we're dead." The words hit me like another blow. Dead? Why would we need them to think we were dead? This was an accident, wasn't it? A terrible, horrible accident that— "I can see Dad's jacket," Victoria called down, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air, the blue one. "What about movement?" David asked. There was a pause, then Victoria's response, "Nothing. They're not moving at all." I felt Margaret's body tense beside me. She was holding her breath, and I realized with growing horror that she was right. We needed to lie perfectly still. "Should we call for help?" David asked, but again, there was something wrong with his tone. The question sounded perfunctory, like he was going through motions. "The cell service is terrible up here," Victoria replied. "By the time we get back to the village and bring help— I mean, look at that drop and all those rocks." "You're right," David said after a moment. "There's no way they could have survived that fall." Survived. The word echoed in my mind, each syllable a knife twisting in my chest. My own son was standing up there, looking down at what he believed were his parents' broken bodies, and he was talking about survival like it was a math problem. "We should get back," Victoria said. "Tell the others what happened. There will be questions, investigations. We need to be prepared." "Yes," David agreed. This is tragic. Such a horrible accident. I could hear them moving away from the edge, their voices fading as they walked back toward the trail. But just before they disappeared completely, I caught one last exchange. "Do you think," David started. "Don't," Victoria cut him off sharply. "Don't second-guess this now. It's done." Then silence. Margaret and I lay there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, listening to the wind and the distant sound of birds. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I'd just heard. This wasn't an accident. Victoria had pushed us, deliberately. And David had known. My son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the young man I'd walked to his first day of college, the groom whose hand I'd shaken at his wedding, had just watched his wife try to murder his parents and felt nothing but impatience about whether we were actually dead. "Margaret," I whispered when I was sure they were gone. "How did you know?" She turned to look at me, and in her eyes I saw a pain that had nothing to do with the fall. "Because I've been watching her poison you for months." The words hung in the mountain air between us like a death sentence. Poison. My wife of 40 years had just told me that our daughter-in-law had been poisoning me. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind rushing through the alpine peaks above us. Margaret's hand was still gripping mine, and I could feel her trembling. Blood had dried on her temple, and her usually perfect silver hair was matted against her head. But her eyes were sharp, focused, and filled with a terrible clarity. "The headaches you've been having," she said quietly. "The nausea, the memory lapses, the way you've been so tired lately, so confused sometimes. I thought it was just age at first, maybe early signs of—" She couldn't finish the sentence. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what she was saying. For the past 6 months I had been experiencing exactly what she described. Headaches that came out of nowhere and lasted for hours. Waves of nausea that would hit me at random times during the day. Moments where I would walk into a room and forget completely why I was there. The doctor said it was normal, I managed. Stress from retirement, getting older. "Dr. Harrison never saw you," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victoria always insisted on taking you to her friend, that Dr. Richards. Remember, she said he was a specialist, that he understood these kinds of issues better." The memory came flooding back. Victoria had been so concerned, so caring. She'd researched doctors, made appointments, even driven me to the consultations herself when Margaret was visiting her sister in Florida. Dr. Richards had been young, confident, reassuring. He'd prescribed medication for the headaches, vitamins for the fatigue, and had told me that what I was experiencing was completely normal for a man my age. "But the medicine helped," I said weakly. "The pills Victoria picked up from the pharmacy." Margaret's grip on my hand tightened. "Randall, I need you to think carefully. When did the symptoms start?" I closed my eyes, trying to remember. The pain in my ribs was making it hard to concentrate, but I forced myself to focus. It was around Christmas time, right after Victoria moved in with David. "Right after she started cooking for us twice a week," Margaret said. "Right after she began bringing you your morning coffee in bed on Sundays. Right after she insisted on organizing your pill box for you." The pieces began falling into place, each one more horrifying than the last. Victoria had inserted herself into our routine so gradually, so naturally, that I'd barely noticed. She'd been the perfect daughter-in-law, thoughtful and caring. When Margaret had her book club meetings on Wednesday evenings, Victoria would stop by with dinner. When I mentioned having trouble sleeping, she'd brought over herbal tea that was supposed to help. "The tea," I said suddenly. "That special blend she ordered online. She said it was from Switzerland, that it would help with my insomnia." "I found the empty containers in her car," Margaret said. "Last week, when she asked me to get her purse from the back seat, there were 4 empty bottles of something called Sleepies tucked under the seat. But Randall, when I looked up the ingredients online, it wasn't just herbal tea. It contained traces of arsenic." Arsenic. The word hit me like a physical blow. I'd read about it in detective novels, seen it in movies. The classic poison, tasteless and odorless, administered in small doses over time to avoid detection. "That's impossible," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. The evidence was all there, had been all along. I'd just been too trusting, too naive to see it. "I wanted to be wrong," Margaret continued, her voice breaking slightly. God, how I wanted to be wrong. But then I started watching more carefully. The way she always insisted on serving your food first. The way she'd bring you water when you took your evening medication. The way your symptoms always seemed worse after she visited. I thought about the past few months, about the gradual decline in my health and energy, about the way Victoria had seemed so concerned, so helpful, about how David had praised her for taking such good care of his aging parents. But why? I asked. What could she possibly gain from? I stopped mid-sentence as another realization hit me. The phone call from my brother Robert's lawyer last week. The inheritance I was set to receive from Robert's estate. $2.3 million that I'd planned to split between David and Margaret, with a portion set aside for our grandchildren's college funds. She knows about Robert's money, I said. Margaret nodded grimly. I think she's known for months. Remember when that lawyer called back in January? Victoria answered the phone. She said it was a wrong number, but I saw her face when she hung up. She looked, calculating. The timeline was becoming clearer now. Robert had died in December, and the estate was taking time to settle due to some complicated investments. The lawyer had said we should expect the inheritance to be finalized by the end of the month. Victoria had been in the room when he'd explained the amount. When he'd mentioned that as Robert's only surviving sibling, I would inherit everything. $2.3 million, I whispered. More than enough to make murder seem worthwhile, Margaret said bitterly. We lay there in silence for a few minutes, both of us absorbing the magnitude of what we'd discovered. My own son's wife had been slowly killing me, and somehow my son was part of it. The caring, concerned daughter-in-law had been nothing more than a performance, a careful act designed to position herself perfectly for when I finally succumbed to the poison. The fall wasn't random, I said suddenly. She pushed us today because the inheritance is being finalized next week, Margaret finished. I heard her on the phone yesterday talking to someone about timing. I thought she was planning a surprise party for your birthday next month, but now we knew better. Victoria had been planning my death, and she'd grown impatient waiting for the poison to finish the job. The scenic overlook, the family photo, the helpful push toward the edge, it had all been carefully orchestrated. Margaret, I said, turning to look at my wife's bruised but determined face. How long have you known? She was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the sky. I started suspecting about 2 months ago. You were getting worse so quickly and the doctors couldn't find anything wrong. Then I noticed the way Victoria watched you when you ate, like she was waiting for something. Why didn't you tell me? Because I hoped I was being paranoid. Because she's our son's wife and David loves her so much. Because accusing someone of attempted murder without proof is. She trailed off, then met my eyes. And because I was afraid you wouldn't believe me. The worst part was, she would have been right. If Margaret had come to me 2 months ago with accusations about Victoria poisoning me, I would have dismissed it as jealousy or paranoia. I would have defended Victoria, assured Margaret that she was imagining things. I would have chosen denial over the horrible truth. We need to get out of here, I said, trying to sit up and immediately regretting it as pain shot through my ribs. Carefully, Margaret warned. We can't let them see us from the trail. As we began the painful process of assessing our injuries and figuring out how to climb off this ledge without being spotted, one thought kept racing through my mind. If Victoria was willing to push us off a cliff to speed up my death, what would she do when she discovered we'd survived? It took us nearly 2 hours to make our way off that ledge. Every movement sent waves of pain through my battered body, but the physical agony was nothing compared to what Margaret told me as we carefully picked our way down the rocky slope, staying hidden from the main trail above. David's been stealing from your business accounts, she said quietly, as we paused behind a cluster of pine trees. For over a year now. I stared at her, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach all over again. What? Margaret pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. Even in our desperate situation, she'd somehow managed to save this evidence. I've been tracking the withdrawals, small amounts at first, 500 here, 1,000 there, but in the past 3 months it's escalated. 20,000 in February, 15,000 in March. The numbers swam before my eyes. David had access to the business accounts because I'd added him as a signatory 2 years ago. When I'd started talking about retirement, I'd wanted him to gradually take over the family construction company to learn the financial side of the business. I'd trusted him completely. How much? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. As of last week, $87,000. The amount hit me like a sledgehammer. $87,000. More than most people made in 2 years, stolen by my own son from the business I'd spent 35 years building. There's more, Margaret continued, her voice barely audible over the wind. I hired a private investigator 3 weeks ago. I had to know what was happening to our family, why you were getting sicker, why David seemed so distant lately. A private investigator, my practical, trusting wife had been driven to hire a stranger to spy on our own family. The thought made my chest tighten with shame and grief. What did he find? Margaret reached into her other pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, creased and dirty now from our fall. David's been gambling, not just casual weekend poker games. He owes money to some very dangerous people. The investigator followed him to an underground casino in the warehouse district. High-stakes games, the kind where they break your legs if you don't pay. I closed my eyes, leaning back against the rough bark of a pine tree. My son, the boy who'd been afraid of his own shadow until he was 12, was mixed up with criminals. The same son who'd called me old-fashioned for keeping a gun in the house, who'd lectured me about the dangers of gambling when the state lottery started. How much does he owe? $150,000. The number made my head spin. Even with the money he'd stolen from me, David was still in debt for over $60,000. And the inheritance from Robert would solve all his problems in one fell swoop. That's why Victoria agreed to marry him, I said suddenly. The pieces were clicking into place now, forming a picture so ugly I wanted to deny it. She knew about his debts, knew about Robert's estate. She married him for the money. Margaret nodded. The investigator looked into her background too. Randall, Victoria isn't who she says she is. I opened my eyes and looked at my wife. After 40 years of marriage, I could read her expressions like a book, and right now she looked like she was about to deliver the worst news yet. Her real name is Victoria Chen. She's been married twice before, both times to older men with substantial assets. Her first husband died in what was ruled an accidental fall down the stairs. Her second husband died from what appeared to be a heart attack, but there were traces of digitalis in his system that were never fully explained. The cold mountain air seemed to freeze in my lungs. You're telling me she's done this before? The investigator thinks so. Both men changed their wills shortly before they died, leaving everything to Victoria. Both had adult children who were cut out of the inheritance entirely. I thought about the will I'd updated 6 months ago, right after David and Victoria's wedding. Victoria had been so sweet, so concerned about making sure everything was properly organized for the family. She'd even recommended the lawyer, a friend of hers who specialized in estate planning. Did I change my will to include her? Margaret's silence was answer enough. Oh God, I whispered. How much? 50% to David, 40% to Victoria as daughter-in-law, 10% to charity. The lawyer said it was a lovely gesture, providing for your son's wife in case something happened to David. 50% of Robert's inheritance alone would be over $1 million, not counting my own assets, the house, the business. Victoria would walk away with enough money to disappear forever, probably to find her next victim. She's not just poisoning me, I said. She's positioning herself to inherit everything even if David dies too. Margaret nodded grimly. The investigator thinks David doesn't know about her past. He thinks he's in love with a woman who's going to help him solve his financial problems. He has no idea she's planning to get rid of both of us and probably him too, once the inheritance is secured. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us absorbing the magnitude of what we'd discovered. This wasn't just about greed or desperation. Victoria was a serial killer, and David was both her accomplice and her next victim. The question is, Margaret said finally, does David know about the poisoning? I thought back to the conversation I'd overheard from the cliff, the way David had sounded when he'd asked about calling for help. There had been nervousness in his voice, but also something else. Relief, maybe, or impatience. I think he knows she's killing me, I said slowly, but I don't think he knows she's planning to kill him too. What do we do? It was a question I'd never thought I'd have to answer. How do you fight back against your own family? How do you protect yourself from the people you love most? I looked at Margaret, at this woman who'd stood by me for 4 decades, who'd suspected something was wrong and had the courage to investigate even when it meant discovering the worst about our son. She was sitting there with blood dried on her face, probably with broken ribs and a concussion, but her eyes were clear and determined. We can't go to the police, I said. Not yet. They think we're dead, which gives us an advantage. If we surface now, Victoria will just claim the fall was an accident and we're suffering from head injuries or delusions. And David will back her up, Margaret added. So we need proof. Real evidence. Not just suspicions and circumstantial connections. Margaret reached back into her jacket and pulled out something I hadn't noticed before, a small digital recorder. I've been recording conversations for 2 weeks, she said. Every time Victoria comes over, every phone call David makes when he thinks we can't hear. It's not enough yet, but it's a start. I stared at the device in her hands, this tiny machine that represented my wife's desperate attempt to save our lives and expose the truth about our family. We need to get back to the village without being seen, I said. Let them think we're dead while we figure out how to prove what they've done. Margaret nodded, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was love and determination mixed with something harder, something that reminded me of the steel that had helped her build a successful real estate business from nothing. Randall, she said quietly, when this is over, we're not just going to expose them, we're going to make sure they lose everything, just like they tried to take everything from us. As we began making our way carefully down the mountain, staying hidden from the trails where David and Victoria might still be searching, I realized that my wife was right. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about justice. We found shelter in an abandoned mountain cabin about 2 miles from the main trail. It was nothing more than 4 walls and a leaking roof, but it was hidden and dry, and most importantly, David and Victoria would never think to look for us there. Margaret tended to my injuries as best she could with torn fabric from her jacket and water from a stream that ran behind the cabin. My ribs were definitely cracked, and I was pretty sure I had a concussion, but we were alive. That was more than Victoria had planned for. As night fell and the temperature dropped, Margaret pulled out her phone. No signal, as expected in these mountains, but she'd been smart enough to download everything she'd discovered before we left for this trip. "Show me what else you found," I said, settling carefully against the cabin wall. Margaret scrolled through files and photos she'd saved to her phone. The private investigator was very thorough. "Look at this." She showed me a series of photographs taken at what appeared to be a law office. In one, Victoria was shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit. In another, she was signing documents. The timestamp showed these photos were taken just 2 days ago, while Margaret and I had been packing for our anniversary trip. "She met with a lawyer while we were getting ready to leave," Margaret explained. "Not the same one who helped you change your will. This is a different firm, one that specializes in what they call inheritance disputes." I studied the photos, feeling my stomach clench. "She's already planning to contest something, or preparing to defend against challenges to your will," Margaret said. The investigator managed to get some information about what they discussed. Apparently, Victoria was asking about the legal process for inheriting when the deceased has no surviving immediate family. The words hit me like ice water. No surviving immediate family. That meant she was planning to eliminate not just me, but David too. Margaret swiped to the next set of photos, and I felt my blood turn cold. These showed Victoria at what looked like a pharmacy, but not the usual chain store where she'd claimed to pick up my medications. "This is a compounding pharmacy," Margaret explained. "They specialize in custom-mixed medications." The investigator followed her there 3 times over the past month. What was she getting? That's where it gets interesting. The investigator couldn't get the exact details without a warrant, but he noticed she always paid in cash and left with small unmarked containers. The same type of containers I found in her car. I stared at the photos, seeing Victoria's face in profile as she spoke to the pharmacist. She looked calm, businesslike. This was routine for her. "There's something else," Margaret said quietly. "About David." She scrolled to a new set of photos and my heart broke all over again. These showed my son at the underground casino she'd mentioned earlier, but there were other photos too. David meeting with men in expensive cars. David looking scared, desperate. David handing over envelopes that were obviously full of cash. "The people he owes money to aren't just casino operators," Margaret said. "They're connected to organized crime. The investigator thinks David borrowed money from loan sharks to pay gambling debts, and now he owes money to people who don't just break legs. They kill." I closed my eyes, trying to process everything. My son wasn't just a gambling addict who'd stolen from me. He was in debt to killers desperate enough to participate in murdering his own parents. "How long has this been going on?" The investigator traced the gambling back about 2 years, but the borrowing from dangerous people, that started about 8 months ago. Right around the time David started talking about how much he loved Victoria, how she was helping him become a better man. 8 months ago. That was when David had started seeming different, more distant but also more confident. I'd attributed it to happiness in his marriage, maturity. Instead, he'd been spiraling deeper into a world I couldn't have imagined. "She knew," I said suddenly. "Victoria knew about his debts before they got married. She sought him out because he was vulnerable." Margaret nodded. "The investigator thinks so too. David's been posting about his financial problems on social media for over a year, complaining about work, about not having enough money. Victoria would have seen those posts, realized he was the perfect target. A desperate man with wealthy parents and a gambling addiction," I said bitterly. She probably couldn't believe her luck. Margaret showed me more photos, these ones of Victoria with other people I didn't recognize. Men and women in expensive clothes meeting at upscale restaurants and hotel bars. "The investigator thinks she's part of a network," Margaret said. "People who target families with substantial assets. They find vulnerable family members, exploit their weaknesses, and systematically eliminate anyone who stands between them and inheritance money." The idea made me feel physically sick. Victoria wasn't just a serial killer. She was part of an organized group that specialized in destroying families from the inside. How many families have they done this to? The investigator couldn't get exact numbers, but he identified at least 4 other cases in the past 5 years where similar patterns emerged. Older, wealthy individuals dying under suspicious circumstances, with new family members inheriting substantial amounts. I thought about all the times Victoria had been so helpful, so caring. The way she'd insisted on cooking for us, on organizing my medications, on being involved in every aspect of our lives. It had all been calculated, professional. What about the police? Haven't they noticed these patterns? Margaret sighed. The deaths happen in different states, different jurisdictions, and they're usually ruled accidental or natural causes. Poison is hard to detect if you're not looking for it specifically, and falls can always be explained as accidents. We sat in silence for a while, both of us overwhelmed by the scope of what we'd discovered. This wasn't just about our family anymore. Victoria and her associates were professional killers, and we'd stumbled into the middle of their operation. Margaret, I said finally, we can't just expose Victoria and David. We need to stop this entire network. She looked at me, and I could see the same determination in her eyes that I was feeling. The investigator gave me contact information for an FBI agent who specializes in inheritance fraud, she said. Someone who's been tracking these kinds of cases for years. But we need more evidence than we have now. Evidence that could get us killed if they discover we're still alive. Margaret pulled out the digital recorder again. That's why we need to be smart about this. We let them think they succeeded. We gather the evidence we need, and then we make sure they pay for everything they've done, not just to us, but to all their victims. I looked at my wife, this woman who'd been by my side for 40 years, and realized I was seeing a side of her I'd never known existed. She wasn't just angry or hurt. She was coldly, calculatingly furious, and she was ready to take down everyone who'd threatened our family. What do you need me to do? Margaret smiled, but it wasn't the warm, gentle smile I'd fallen in love with decades ago. This was something sharper, more dangerous. First, we need to get back to civilization without being seen. Then we need to make contact with that FBI agent. And then we need to convince David and Victoria that we're really dead long enough to catch them in the act. As we prepared to spend the night in that cold, leaking cabin, planning our next moves, I realized that tomorrow would mark the beginning of the most dangerous game of our lives. But for the first time since we'd fallen off that cliff, I felt something other than fear and betrayal. I felt hope. 3 days after our supposed deaths, Margaret and I watched from a rented car as David and Victoria met with Robert's estate lawyer. We'd made it back to civilization, contacted the FBI agent, and now we were gathering the final pieces of evidence we needed to destroy them both. The FBI agent Sarah Chen had been tracking Victoria's network for 2 years. When Margaret called her from a burner phone, Agent Chen had immediately flown to Switzerland to coordinate with us. Victoria's real name is Victoria Zhao, Agent Chen had explained during our secret meeting at a safe house. She's wanted in connection with 6 suspicious deaths across 4 states, but we've never been able to get enough evidence to make charges stick. Now, watching through high-powered binoculars as Victoria smiled and signed papers that would make her a millionaire, I felt a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. They're claiming the inheritance, Margaret said, adjusting the recording equipment Agent Chen had given us. David just showed them our death certificates. Death certificates that had been remarkably easy to obtain. A few bribes to the right officials, some falsified medical reports, and officially, Margaret and I had died from injuries sustained in our fall. Victoria had been thorough, professional. She'd done this before. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen. Are you getting clear audio? I looked at Margaret, who nodded and gave me a thumbs up. The recording equipment was picking up everything through the law office's windows. $2.3 million, we heard Victoria saying clearly, to be divided according to Randall's last will and testament, 50% to David Holloway and 40% to Victoria Holloway as surviving daughter-in-law. What about the remaining 10%? The lawyer asked. That was designated for charity, David said, and I could hear the eagerness in his voice even from across the street. But given the circumstances, we'd like to redirect that to cover funeral expenses and estate management costs. They were stealing even the money I'd wanted to give to charity, the 10% that was supposed to go to the children's hospital where I'd volunteered for 15 years. Of course, the lawyer said. Very reasonable under the circumstances. Victoria leaned forward in her chair. There is one other matter. Randall's business accounts and assets. Since David was a signatory on those accounts, we'll need to transfer everything into David's name immediately. Actually, the lawyer said, shuffling through papers, there's a notation here about some irregularities in the business accounts that were flagged for investigation. I saw David's body language change instantly. His shoulders tensed and he shot a nervous glance at Victoria. What kind of irregularities? Victoria asked, her voice sharp. Some large withdrawals over the past year that weren't properly documented. The bank flagged them for review before the inheritance could be processed. This was perfect. Agent Chen had arranged for the bank to delay processing while we gathered evidence. David was about to reveal himself completely. Those withdrawals were legitimate business expenses, David said quickly. Dad asked me to handle some cash transactions for tax purposes. The lie came so easily, so smoothly. This was my son, claiming I'd asked him to commit tax fraud to cover up his theft. Victoria placed a hand on David's arm, a gesture that looked supportive, but I could see her fingers digging into his sleeve. A warning. Perhaps we should postpone this discussion, she said sweetly. David is still grieving his parents' tragic death. It's difficult for him to focus on these details right now. Of course, the lawyer said sympathetically. We can schedule another meeting next week. As they prepared to leave, I heard Victoria whisper something to David that made my blood run cold. We need to talk. You're going to ruin everything. Margaret and I followed them at a distance as they drove to David's house. Our house, technically, though I'd signed it over to him 6 months ago as part of what I'd thought was smart estate planning. Another decision Victoria had encouraged. We parked down the street and activated the long-range listening device Agent Chen had provided. What we heard through their living room window was the final confirmation of everything we'd suspected. You idiot, Victoria hissed the moment they were inside. Do you have any idea how much attention you've drawn to those accounts? I was careful, David protested. Small amounts spread out over time. $87,000 isn't small amounts, you moron. And now the bank is investigating right when we need clean access to the inheritance. So what do? We stick to the plan. The investigation will find that your father authorized those withdrawals before he died. I've already prepared the forged documents. Forged documents. Agent Chen's recording equipment was capturing every word. What about the other thing? David asked, and his voice dropped to a whisper. The poison. What if they test the bodies? They won't, Victoria said confidently. Mountain falls cause massive trauma. No one's going to look for poison in a couple of accident victims, and even if they did, the arsenic levels have probably dropped enough by now to seem incidental. I still can't believe we actually did it, David said, and I could hear him pacing. I keep thinking they're going to walk through that door. They're not walking through any door, Victoria snapped. They're dead, David, splattered on rocks at the bottom of a cliff, and in 2 weeks we'll have enough money to pay off your debts and disappear somewhere with no extradition treaties. Disappear. So the plan had always been to take the money and run, leaving David's debts and probably David himself behind. What about the other families? David asked. The people you worked with before? Are they getting a cut? That's not your concern, Victoria said, her voice turning dangerous. Your job was to provide access to your parents and keep your mouth shut. You've barely managed the first part. I did everything you asked, David said, and now he sounded desperate. I gave you access to Dad's medicine, I helped you get close to them, I even helped you push them off that cliff. You hesitated, Victoria said coldly. For a moment up there, I thought you were going to back out. That would have been problematic. The threat in her voice was unmistakable. Margaret gripped my hand tightly as we listened to our son being intimidated by the woman he thought he loved. What happens now? David asked. Now we wait for the inheritance to clear. Then we take care of your gambling debts. Then we disappear. Together, right? We disappear together? There was a long pause before Victoria answered. Of course, darling, together. But something in her tone made it clear that David's usefulness was almost at an end. Margaret looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. Our son had helped murder us for money, and now he was being manipulated by a woman who was planning to kill him too. We have enough, I whispered. Agent Chen said we just needed them to confess to the murders and the financial crimes. Margaret nodded, but she wasn't ready to stop recording yet. Wait, I want to hear what she says about the other victims. As if summoned by Margaret's words, Victoria's phone rang inside the house. It's Marcus, she said to David. Go upstairs. This is business you don't need to hear. We heard David's footsteps on the stairs, then Victoria's voice became crisp, professional. The Holloway job is almost complete, she said into the phone. The inheritance should clear within 2 weeks. How are the Chicago and Miami prospects developing? Chicago and Miami. Agent Chen had mentioned suspicious deaths in both cities. Good, Victoria continued. The Denver family should be ready for Phase 2 by the end of the month. The son there is even more cooperative than David was. Phase 2. Another family was about to go through what we'd experienced. No, I don't think we'll have any problems with David, Victoria said, and her voice turned cold. He served his purpose. After the money clears, he'll have an unfortunate accident. Grief-stricken widower, drowning himself in alcohol and pills. Very sad, very believable. Margaret gasped softly beside me. Victoria was planning to kill David within weeks of inheriting our money. I'll call you when it's finished, Victoria said, then hung up. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing what we'd just heard. Our son wasn't just a co-conspirator in our murders. He was Victoria's next victim, and he had no idea. We have to save him, Margaret whispered. I looked at my wife, this woman who'd just heard our son confess to helping kill us, and she was still worried about protecting him. He helped her poison me, I said quietly. He pushed us off a cliff. She manipulated him, Margaret said firmly. He's in debt to criminals, scared, desperate. She took advantage of that. I wanted to argue, to point out that David had made choices, that fear didn't excuse attempted murder, but looking at Margaret's face, I realized she was right about one thing. Whatever David had done, he didn't deserve to die for it. Agent Chen needs to move now, I said, before Victoria kills David and disappears. Margaret nodded, reaching for the secure phone Agent Chen had given us. It's time to come back from the dead. 2 weeks later, I stood in the hallway outside a federal courtroom, watching as Victoria Zhao was led away in handcuffs. She'd maintained her composure throughout the trial, but when the judge read the verdict, guilty on 6 counts of murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, and racketeering, something finally cracked in that perfect facade. She looked directly at me as the bailiff guided her toward the door, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw genuine emotion in her eyes. Not remorse, not guilt, but pure, undiluted rage. This isn't over, she mouthed silently. I stared back at her without flinching. Yes, it is. Agent Chen had moved fast once we'd given her the recordings. Within hours of our phone call, federal agents had arrested Victoria, David, and 3 other members of her network. The evidence we'd gathered, combined with what the FBI had been collecting for 2 years, was overwhelming. David's situation was more complicated. His lawyer had negotiated a plea deal, 25 years in federal prison in exchange for his full cooperation in identifying other victims and ongoing targets of Victoria's network. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was something. Margaret appeared beside me, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the courthouse cafeteria. She looked older than she had 6 months ago, more fragile, but there was a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "How are you feeling?" she asked, handing me one of the cups. "Tired," I said honestly. "Relieved. Angry. I'm not sure I know how to feel normal anymore." The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of depositions, testimony, and media attention. The story of our staged deaths and the murder for inheritance network had made national news. I'd had to relive the moment of our fall, the betrayal, the poisoning, over and over again for prosecutors, agents, and reporters. The prosecutor said they've identified at least 12 other victims across 7 states, Margaret said quietly. 12 families destroyed by Victoria's network. 12 families, 12 people who'd trusted the wrong person, who'd been murdered by people they'd welcomed into their homes. The scope of it still took my breath away, and the other targets they were working on, all safe now. The FBI arrested the entire network yesterday. Victoria's boss, Marcus Chen, is facing life without parole. The woman in Denver, the man in Chicago, the couple in Miami, they're all in custody. I nodded, feeling some of the tension finally leaving my shoulders. It was over, really over. "What about the money?" I asked. Margaret smiled, and for the first time in months, it was her real smile. "Robert's inheritance has been released to us, along with all the money David stole from your business accounts. Plus, the FBI recovered assets from Victoria's previous victims. We're wealthy, Randall. Very wealthy. $2.3 million from Robert, plus the recovered stolen funds, plus restitution from the criminal network. It was more money than we'd ever dreamed of having. I've been thinking about what to do with it," Margaret continued. "I want to set up a fund for families affected by inheritance fraud. Help other people who've been targeted by networks like Victoria's." I looked at my wife, this woman who'd saved our lives through her suspicion and determination, and felt my love for her deepen in ways I hadn't thought possible. "That's perfect," I said. We walked out of the courthouse together, past the reporters and cameras, past the crowd of curious onlookers. Margaret had insisted we give one final statement to the media, not for attention, but to warn other families about the signs we'd missed. "Trust your instincts," she'd told the cameras that morning. "If something feels wrong about a new person in your family's life, investigate. Don't let politeness or fear of seeming paranoid prevent you from protecting the people you love." As we reached our car, my phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart raced. Old habits from the weeks of fear and paranoia. But the message was from Agent Chen. "David wants to see you. Says he has something important to tell you before sentencing next week." I showed the text to Margaret. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the phone screen. "Do you want to see him?" she asked finally. Did I? David was my son, the boy I'd raised, The man I'd trusted with my business and my life. He was also the person who'd helped poison me and push me off a cliff for money. I don't know, I said honestly. He's still our son, Margaret said quietly. What he did was unforgivable, but he's still our son. 3 days later, I sat across from David in a federal detention center. He looked terrible. Thin, pale, older than his 35 years. Prison orange didn't suit him. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to make this easy for him. "I need you to know that I never wanted you to die," he continued. "Victoria told me the poison would just make you sick, that we'd get you to the hospital in time, that you'd recover, but be too confused to remember what happened. But you knew she was poisoning me." David's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, God help me, yes, I knew. And the cliff? She said we were just going to scare you. Push you down a few feet, make it look like an accident, then rescue you. She said you'd be grateful, that you'd never suspect us after we saved your lives." I stared at my son. This man who'd been so desperate, so scared that he'd believed obvious lies. "David," I said quietly, "she was going to kill you too. After the inheritance cleared, you were going to have an accident." His face went white. "What?" "We heard her on the phone with her handler. You were never part of her long-term plans. You were just a tool." David buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I was scared. I owed those people so much money, and Victoria seemed like she had all the answers. The gambling debts are paid," I said. "I took care of them." David looked up, surprised. "You? Why?" "Because despite everything you've done, you're still my son. And because I don't want those criminals coming after you in prison." We sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, David spoke again. "Victoria wasn't working alone, not completely. There's something the FBI doesn't know yet." I leaned forward. "What?" "She has a sister, twin sister. Goes by the name Susan Mills. She's been running cons on the West Coast while Victoria worked the East. They were planning to meet up after the job was finished." A twin sister. Another professional killer still out there. "The FBI needs to know this immediately," I said, already reaching for my phone. David nodded. "I'll tell them everything I know. It's the least I can do." As I prepared to leave, David called out one last time. "Dad, do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" I turned back to look at my son, this broken man who'd betrayed everything I'd taught him about family and loyalty and love. "I don't know, David," I said honestly, "but I hope someday I can." 6 months later, Margaret and I were sitting on the porch of our new house in North Carolina, far from the memories and pain of our old life. The Holloway Family Trust for Inheritance Fraud Victims was officially established, with Margaret as its director. We'd already helped 4 families who'd discovered they were being targeted by similar networks. Victoria Zhao was serving 6 consecutive life sentences in federal prison. Her sister Susan had been arrested in Oregon 2 weeks after David gave the FBI her information. The entire network had been dismantled. David would be eligible for parole in 20 years. Whether we'd have any relationship with him when he got out remained to be seen. Margaret reached over and took my hand as we watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. "Any regrets?" she asked. I thought about the question seriously. We'd lost our son, our old life, our sense of security. We'd learned that the people we loved most were capable of betraying us in ways we'd never imagined. But we were alive, we were together, and we'd stopped a network of killers from destroying other families. "No," I said finally, "no regrets." Margaret squeezed my hand, and we sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, leaving us in the peaceful darkness of our new beginning.